Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. My name is Luke Gustafson and I work with University of Maryland Extension based in the Charles County office, and I'll be talking about getting started with vegetable gardening, kind of a primer. Anyone, especially if you're new to veggie gardening, hopefully I'll give you some tips to get started. If you are an experienced vegetable gardener, hopefully you can learn some new things as well. And so just to begin, University of Maryland Extension is basically the outreach arm of University of Maryland. And we have an office in every county in the state, as well as Baltimore City. My particular position, I work and advise homeowners like you, and I also have the privilege of working with a great group of volunteers, Master Gardener volunteers, that provide research-based, unbiased information on gardening, which is what we are doing here tonight. So I will mention that my position is almost entirely funded by county dollars. So those of you in Charles County, thank you for your support. We really do try and be a resource in the community. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have any follow-up questions after tonight, and whether it's soil testing or veggie gardening or what have you, anything kind of related to home gardening is my area, and I'd love to be able to help you get the answers that you are looking for. All right, getting to vegetable gardening. This is a brief outline of what we'll be covering tonight. Starting off with some of the why. Obviously, if you are tuned in tonight, you are interested for one reason or another in growing vegetables. And if you want to maybe throw in the chat box there, how many years you've been growing vegetables. It could be 0. Maybe you're just starting off, and that's great. Or maybe you've grown vegetables for a long time. You have decades. You started growing tomatoes with your grandma, and if you throw it in your chat box just to get kind of a quick idea of who's tuned in. So we have some first timers, first year vegetable gardening, someone that's been doing it for 30 years, 2 years, 3 years, 0 years, 14 years, 15. Okay, so kind of a range. That's great. So we have a number of different backgrounds. So again, hopefully we can give you some information that will be useful to all of those. I do find that often gardening is shared, it's passed down from one generation to the next, and so it's neat to see that how that influences people, and maybe even some of the vegetables that you decide to grow have sentimental attachment. So that's great. All right. So flipping to the next slide, if I can get it to advance. I like to start some of my talks with this quote, and maybe you can guess who wrote this. And the most valuable of all arts will be the art of deriving a comfortable subsistence from the smallest area of soil. All right, so someone guessed Thomas Jefferson. No, it's not Thomas Jefferson. Not too far off. He was a president. And it was not Washington. In fact, good job, was Lincoln. In 1859, in an address to the Washington State Agricultural Society. So we might not think that we'll be able to provide all of our subsistence, all of our calorie needs from a vegetable garden, but it certainly can provide that satisfying feeling of some amount of self-sufficiency, especially with the kind of chaos around us. it is nice to be out in the garden. There's many therapeutic aspects to that, and it is empowering to be able to grow at least a portion, maybe a small portion, of your vegetables, and it's maybe something that you have more control over than other aspects of your life. Some of the reasons to grow vegetables. This isn't a comprehensive list, but some of the pros are flavor. There's nothing like a fresh picked homegrown tomato, and the nutrition of eating something at the peak of its ripeness, as well as cost. Now, sometimes it can be more expensive to grow your own. Other times you can save money, and as well as beauty. Many of these plants, aside from being delicious, are also beautiful, and you can think about including some of them in a landscape. Some of the colorful varieties of vegetables, like some of the types of chard, can be very ornamental, and you could throw some extra transplants in alongside your annual flowers and things like that. So they do have some ornamental value. As well, again, is that physical activity. Getting out in nature certainly has many physical and mental health benefits. Some of the challenges, of course, are time, because it can be very time consuming, especially when it's the end of June and weeds are growing, it seems, about an inch per second. And that can be a challenge. Or if you come back on vacation and things have really grown and the weeds have gotten out of control, space can be an issue. The cost, especially the initial costs, if you are new to veggie gardening, can be substantial. Now, there are ways to minimize that, starting small, and reusing materials, as well as knowledge, right? If you've never grown something, maybe you don't have the information that you need, and so certainly we hope to help um, with that last part, the knowledge part, with tonight's talk and some of the other resources that are available. And so some of the things to think through, some of the ingredients, if you will, of veggie gardening, I list out here, right? So thinking through, again, if you don't have an established vegetable garden yet, these are really important considerations. Where are you going to put it? Do you have a small backyard? Do you have a big backyard? What are you going to grow in? Be it containers, and you're growing essentially in potting mix in containers, or are you growing direct in the soil? Are you growing in raised beds? As well as water. All these plants really do require additional water. If you think about last season, when we had pretty dry weather from middle of July, all the way through middle of October, without getting water on your crops, your plants are going to suffer, and they're not going to produce to their full potential. So how far away is that site from your spigot? Do you have a hose that's long enough to reach, or can you use buckets or things like that? Water is very heavy, and you learn that the hard way when you have to haul it across a distance in buckets or watering containers. What plants are you going to use? Are you going to buy transplants, or are you going to buy seed and either direct seed those in the ground or grow things indoors to transplant outdoors, as well as labor? Again, that time factor is really important. I encourage anyone that's starting off veggie gardening for the first time to really start small, so you don't get frustrated halfway through or a third way through the season and just kind of throw in the towel. So certainly, start small and then build off your successes for next year. So you're not trying to buy. And so gardening is still enjoyable to you, rather than just a chore that you dread. All right. So when thinking about site, a couple things to keep in mind is that vegetables, uh, whether it's tomatoes or lettuce, they really do prefer full sun. If you don't have full sun, then some of the crops can make do with less than that. But really, it's best if you have at least 6 hours of sun, and the most intense sunlight is going to be, around noontime is the most intense of the day. And so if it's getting some of that noon sun, that's great. Um, Again, I mentioned access to water. Protection from wildlife can be a big deal. And so maybe, again, for this first year, you are starting small and you're doing containers and you've got a porch. That's something that can deter some of the furry critters from getting in your garden. Um, are you growing, do you have space for raised beds? And again, I encourage you to start small. And if you are using containers, make sure you can certainly recycle a lot of different types of containers, whether it's, old storage totes or 5-gallon buckets. But I will note that you really want some kind of drainage holes in the bottom of those containers so you don't drown your plants when it rains. Because if there's not drainage, when we get an inch or 2 inches of rain, then the roots, the soil will become saturated, and without that water being able to drain away, then the roots will be starved of oxygen. And just like you and I, we breathe oxygen, so do the roots of plants. And so they will not survive if they're in standing water for an extended amount of time. All right. So again, just some pictures here of different sites. Could be a backyard. This is up in Baltimore City. This is actually a community garden that is on in a row house community. And so they've got a fairly small space, but they're making it pretty productive. Raised beds. You can have different heights of raised beds. You can accommodate different crops there. You can also grow, if you have a really sunny windowsill, like a south-facing window, you can grow a few things like herbs, where you're harvesting the leaves. Um, you can get by with a little bit less sunlight, growing leafy crops like lettuce and herbs, compared to if you're trying to grow fruiting crops like tomatoes and peppers and beans and so forth. Again, different kinds of containers. You can get creative. If you have things lying around the house, you can certainly repurpose them. It could be old containers, old pots from plants that you've purchased in the past. You can go to a dollar store and pick up laundry baskets for 99 cents or $1, and use those. In the case here, there's a sweet potato that's growing out of that, and that's just a $1 basket lined with a bit of newspaper to keep the potting mix from going out those larger holes in the side, and that does fine. So and then you can also grow greens in containers like that. So there's a lot of different ways to grow. And here's an example. You got all kinds of different pots and different sizes and shapes and different crops. Um, so some plants will want more rooting depth than others. Again, the leafy crops you can usually get by with less sunlight and also with less um, rooting depth, because again, you're just harvesting the leaves of something like basil or of lettuce or other greens. But if you have a tomato plant, you want to give that at least a 5-gallon pot, a 5-gallon bucket, or a nursery container, or what have you. But there's a lot of different ways to get creative. And I'll talk specifically about container gardening in next week's webinar, so please check out that. It'll be here again on WebEx at 6 p.m. 1 week from today. So if you're growing in containers, then you're using some type of potting mix. So that's a organic base. So it's based on compost, peat, or shredded wood products. And it's typically lightweight. Whereas if you're growing in raised beds or in the ground, you are growing typically in some type of soil or soil mixture. Maybe you've got soil, but you've added potting mix to it over the years. And soil is different in its properties and its chemistry. It's mineral based, and you can grow a lot of different vegetables in there. You don't have to only grow in, if you're used to growing in containers and you're adding in raised beds, you can certainly just use your native soil. And at times, yeah, you can amend that soil with things like compost to add extra organic matter. As far as soil testing, the ideal pH for soils is about 6.5 for most vegetable crops. If you haven't ever grown veggies in that location, then then it is a good idea to do a soil test. Um, and let's see here, next slide there talks about soil testing. So your basic soil test measures the concentrations of some of the key nutrients, the mineral nutrients that plants require. So things like potassium, calcium, magnesium, as well as phosphorus. But beyond that, it also will tell you the pH, and the pH determines what nutrients are available. So if the pH is too low, then some of those nutrients, although they may be in the soil, are not as available for the plant to take up through their roots. So 6.5 is the ideal for most crops, but between 6 to 6.5 or 6 to 7, most crops will do all right. As far as adding, there's a question about using horse manure, compost, and raised beds. And yes, you can use composted horse manure or other thoroughly composted manures. The one caveat I'll mention is that if it has not been properly composted, then you can get weed seeds coming through, just all the different grasses and plants that the horses ate. If the manure was not properly composted and didn't reach those higher temperatures to kill off those weed seeds, then you can be importing weed seeds into your garden. And let's see. So yeah, if it's a new veggie garden, you can send off a sample to a soil testing lab in the region, and that's about $10 to $15. Some of the labs now, especially the public labs, may be running a bit, have a longer turnaround time on those because of the current situation with COVID-19. But I believe that most of the private labs in the region are operating as normal as far as their sample turnaround times. But you really do, if you're testing it, you want to send it off to one of the labs versus getting one of those at-home test kits because it's a similar price and it's much more accurate. And if you if you have some compost that you're thinking about using, or really any amendment to the garden soil, and you're concerned, either about weed seeds germinating, you can always take a sample of it and put it in a container and water it and watch for weeds to germinate. Now that doesn't mean that other weed seeds won't germinate down the road, as the temperatures are warmer or cooler. But if it's at room temperature, that should be a good way to tell if there's a lot of weed seeds in there. And you can also do a seed test, a germination test, using just beans or peas to, if you are concerned about any herbicide residues in there, you can just take a sample of that in a container and put some bean or pea seeds in there as a way of testing to see if the germination or growth of the new seedling is affected. All right, yeah, I think I'll move on to the next one. So water, again, we all know, plants need it, and when it doesn't come from the sky, then we need to provide it, right, by a watering can or a hose. And so in containers, you will need to water more frequently, which is one of the drawbacks of growing in smaller spaces, unfortunately, is that depending on the size of the plant and the size of the container, how much water it has access in that container, you will need to be watering several times a week or daily, depending on how hot it is and how much water that plant is drawing up. When you water, really focus on getting that water to the ground, because that's where the roots take it up from, versus watering the leaves. That can help to reduce some disease issues that are brought on or that are encouraged by moist or damp leaves. And then mulching, that's one way to reduce the water loss by evaporation from the soil surface. So you can think about mulching, some of the common mulches in veggie gardens are things like straw, which can have some drawbacks. You can introduce weed seeds through that, but it is one way to keep down weeds and also to reduce water loss. All right. Some of the challenges, of course, are our furry friends and feathered friends, and they can come in and they're sometimes waiting for the harvest just as eagerly as we are. But there are some ways to either deter or keep them out of the garden completely. With birds, you can use netting over plants, especially if you're growing berries. They love blueberries. And so people can sometimes put on a bird netting. I will mention that it's important to keep that tight, because loose netting can be difficult, or can be easy for birds to get caught in, and you certainly don't want that happening. So keeping it tight can reduce the chances of birds getting caught and tangled up in the netting. Scarecrows, there's those inflatable scary eye things, those can help deter somewhat. Mostly in the vegetable garden, we have rabbits and groundhogs as well as deer as the main problems. And all of those can be deterred, not always eliminated completely, but deterred by fencing. So with rabbits, you have to have a small enough mesh size to keep rabbits out. Groundhogs, since they like to dig, you would want to bury that fencing, bury about at least a 1 foot edge of the fence underground to deter them as they're digging their tunnels. They run into that metal and they're not going to chew into that. And deer are very good at jumping, so they can clear tall fences. They can jump over a 6 foot fence, although that is certainly a deterrence. So if you have a 6 foot fence and your neighbor has the same stuff in their yard, but they have a 4 foot fence, then deer will take the path of least resistance in most cases. I don't pretend to know the mind of a deer, but oftentimes if you can provide somewhat of a deterrent, then they will look elsewhere. And all right, so fencing. Here's just one photo. It doesn't have to be simple. It doesn't have to be complex. Just basic steel T-posts, those green steel T-posts that you can find in most farm supply stores, and some welded wire fencing. In this case, this is a 2 by 4 inch mesh. It doesn't keep out the smaller stuff, but it's pretty inexpensive. And there's also plastic fencing that comes in 6 foot high or 7 foot high, sometimes even taller than that. And that's a pretty simple option. And that's usually about $1 per foot or more, depending on the thickness, the durability, and the height. So those are just some options, and there's more resources on managing wildlife, keeping them out of your veggie garden. but I just want to mention some of these briefly. And also, keeping a dog, sometimes that can help. So a garden dog. Um, here my dog is flipping through the seed catalog. Um, and so here's an example. This is a very lightweight plastic fencing. And so that can work. Again, it's not, if a deer were to push through it, it could, it has the strength to do that, but oftentimes that is enough deterrent to keep them out. So oftentimes it's kind of a cost benefit analysis of how much money you want to put into it and how much time and labor. And how much benefit, what's the chances of deer getting in, and that can change over time. Sometimes you'll have not many deer issues, and then the next season that'll change. In this case here, this is my parents' garden, and we have a guard cat that's trying to stare down that deer. All right. So as you think about planning out your garden, I encourage you to think about the whole gardening season. So here in Maryland, we do have the benefit of a relatively long growing season. I grew up in Minnesota, and we have a much shorter growing season there. It's a bit cooler spring this year, but still you can plan for, you've got cool season crops that you can grow in the springtime, and warm season that you grow through the late spring or spring through the summer. And then you can also do a cool season planting in late August to September for some of those cold hardy crops that can tolerate some frost. So as you think about your garden space, don't just think about one crop in one location, but think about multiple crops and switching those out throughout the season, and also planting multiple successions of one crop, staggering your planting date by a week or so, or a couple of weeks, so you have crops that are coming into harvest on a rolling basis. So here's just an example of a 8 by 3 foot garden bed. Thinking about the warm season crops, you've got tomatoes there in the center, and some cucumbers, as well as a row of green beans. And then for the cool season crop, as those crops, as the beans and tomatoes and cucumbers start to peter out, then you might replace them in the end of August or in September with some frost hardy crops. And now for the main season, for the warm season there, even those beans there, you might do, since they're fairly quick growing, you could do, if you start an early crop, you might then replace that later on in the season because they're pretty quick to harvest compared to tomatoes, for example. So really make use of the seasons that we have here with the warm and cool crop. In the springtime, we have longer days, right? Because the longest day of the year is in late June. So actually, I just threw this chart up here to give you an idea of the day length. Obviously, day length affects plant growth because that's the sun is how they make their food, right? And so we have that peak of day length in late June. So if you are growing stuff on the 1st of May, then you'll have more intense sunlight. You'll have more intense sunlight than, for example, the 1st of September. So as we go into the fall later on in the year, things will start slowing down, in part because of that day length. Now, of course, temperature also affects that. All right. Yeah, and so as you're as the season goes, then the day length shortens, and that's one of the reasons that your fall crops will start to slow down, in addition to the cooler temperatures. All right, so some of the different crops, again, kind of thinking cool season versus warm season. We have beets and broccoli, cabbage, a lot of the brassica can tolerate a certain amount of frost, some more than others, um, as well as collards, kale, pea, potato, radish, and spinach. And actually, I apologize. Carrot should be on the warm season list. It's not really frost tolerant. Um, Warm season, we're thinking about beans, sweet corn, tomatoes, eggplants, melons, squash, pepper, all that stuff. All right. And I encourage you to grow what you enjoy eating, right? Because a big part of the satisfaction of growing a veggie garden is growing stuff that you like to eat personally, or maybe someone in your family. Maybe you hate eggplant, but your significant other does. That would be a good reason to grow eggplant. But as you flip through seed catalogs, you can see a whole diversity of different kinds of crops, and that's one of the fun things I like about veggie gardening is getting to choose. Now, assuming it does well in our area, you get to choose the colors and shapes and all the different flavors, and you get so much more variety than you can in most grocery stores. All right, so here's just a quick transplanting calendar. Some crops are best just direct seeded, and you don't have to mess around with either growing transplants or buying them from the garden center. And others, especially the smaller seeded plants, really do best if you can grow them out as plants indoors and then transplant those out into the garden. So these are the crops that you would want to think about growing as transplants or purchasing as transplants. Today, we're really on the tail end since we're towards the end of April here. So we're on the tail end of being able to grow transplants, um, but you could grow some of your summer crops, start those as transplants, but you wouldn't be getting those out into the garden for another about 6 to 8 weeks. So they'd be later, but that means you've got that space that you could use for something else, for something that's quick growing like greens that can grow well in the month of May. So if you haven't started them, you can think about those being the ones that you buy from the garden center, and then some of the other plants, some of the larger seeded ones, things like squash and cucumbers, those as well as beans and peas, you can just direct seed those. All right. Um, and a lot of those warm season crops, again, they really don't start to grow until things warm up, and that they really need warmer soils. So things like tomatoes, they don't do a whole lot until the soil temperature has reached at least 60 degrees. So if you plant them now and we have really warm May, then that's great, and you've got a jump on the season. If we have you know 3 or so weeks of cooler weather where it's in the 50s and the soil temperature isn't getting up into the 60s very much, then they're not going to do a whole lot. They won't die unless we get a killing frost, but they're just going to kind of hang out and not grow much for you until we get those warmer temperatures. So you can get a simple kitchen thermometer and stick it down into the ground and take the soil's temperature. Just a couple notes on buying seeds and transplants in 2020. With all the disruptions from COVID-19, there have been a lot of delays with mail order seed companies trying to fill that order and do that in a safe way, especially the smaller quantities that most home gardeners order. They have to break down their larger packages that they get from their suppliers into the small little envelopes of 25, 50, 100 seeds that you might be ordering. So that all that process has been delayed. So expect delays if you order. Could be 2 weeks or so, and of course that all depends on the vendor. So if you have a mail order company that you are used to ordering from and you haven't yet, get in touch with them to see what they expect their their delays might be. So you might want to consider just buying your seeds in person at a store if you don't have them already, or at least adjusting your timeline based on those potential delays. If you do buy your seeds in person, I always like to take either a paper physical seed catalog with me, or pull up a catalog on my phone, and that way you can get a lot more information on that variety than what's printed on that small little seed packet. It'll give you more information on disease resistance and things like that. If you can pull up especially a really good seed catalog that has disease resistance information, and you can get more detailed information about the plant growth, size, and things like that, than you would from that small seed packet. And someone posted in the comments here in the chat that that they reached out to 2 different companies, and they said that their delay before their order went out the door is currently at 10 days. So 10 days plus whatever shipping time that it takes to reach you. Yeah, could be about that 2-week mark. So just keep that in mind as you're planning for your garden. If you're buying transplants, you can I encourage people to look at the smaller plants. If you're buying tomatoes, the price of a 6-pack of tomato plants, if you need that many, is usually a lot less per plant than getting a large one. So you don't need to look for one that already has flowers on it and stuff like that. And really, you want to get plants and plant them and let them get established before they put their energy into flowering. So if you have flowers on a tomato plant, when you purchase it, you might just pick off those flowers, let it focus its energy on getting its root system established, growing more leaves to get it better established before it starts diverting its energy from establishment to fruit production. All right. And there's a good video on the Home and Garden Information Center's YouTube channel talking specifically about that, kind of a side-by-side comparison of some of the different plant sizes and kind of their relative costs. So yeah, usually the smaller plants are the best value, and they will reach the same size as those larger transplants in a short amount of time. Starting seed, right? Again, if you are doing this, or if you're doing it now in the spring, or if you want to start transplants later in the summer, again, if you are planning for that cool season harvest, you can plant your kale or broccoli, and then when you swap out, you go from warm season to cool season garden in the fall, then your plants can be off to a bit of a head start. So I have a couple of different pictures here. You can use different containers, right, for starting those transplants. If you have those seed starting trays, that works really well. And you can fit a lot of plants into a small area because they're designed for that. But you can also recycle water bottles, which is what I have up there. There's a couple tiny basil seedlings that are growing in a cut-off water bottle. So I just cut off that section, and it's basically a tube. So you want to make sure that whatever container you're using, you'll be able to easily get the roots out when it's time to transplant it. And not sometimes if it's really twisted or kind of a strange shape, then it's more difficult to get all the roots out intact. The finer seeding mixes generally are best for starting, especially smaller seeds. So that picture there in the middle, a finer mix is easier for the smaller seedlings to push through. So there's not a lot of woody products in there. It doesn't look like a bag of mulch, basically. And if you're growing them inside, you want some additional light beyond just a windowsill, unless if you have a south-facing room and you got a lot of windows around, sometimes you can get by with that. But for most plants, putting on some kind of supplemental light is the best and will keep your plants from getting really tall and spindly or leggy. So when you put them out in the garden, they'll be sturdy. So yeah, just quickly about seed starting. There's more to it, but just wanted to give you just kind of a brief overview of that. So I'm going to go through a couple different crops that you might be thinking, or a number of different crops you might be thinking about planting, and some of the pros and cons and things to watch out for. So lettuce and spinach, right? Some of the different greens out there. There's a lot of different types of lettuce. Leaf lettuce generally does pretty well and is a good cool season crop. And these are things that you can either direct seed or you can transplant. And I apologize that slide. If you're planning for the fall, August through early September is a good time to think about it. If you're going in the springtime, you can be planting those earlier in April through now. And again, you can think about planting these in containers. They don't require a whole lot of rooting depth to grow successfully. Beets and Swiss chard are another great crop, and beets and Swiss chard are actually the same species, but one was developed specifically for their leaves and that nice leaf stalk. Swiss chard comes in a lot of different colors. You can get some really nice mixes with stalks that are that deep red as well as yellows and white. And then beets, of course, you can eat the top, the leaves, as well as the root. And these are pretty versatile, pretty nice to grow, both in containers or in ground. And I really like stuff, where you can eat the above ground and below ground part of it. The more parts of a plant that I can eat, that's a better value, I think, for my time and money. And you can grow these in containers, especially if you're planning on just eating the leaves, like with chard. If you're growing beets, then again, you want to make sure that you have enough rooting depth to allow that root to fully develop. Kale. So kale is a great crop. It's really cold hardy, and yeah, you can think of it for a cool season crop, both in the spring and in the summer. So now you might want to think more about planning for growing that in the fall season. And you can transplant that or seed it directly. And it does really well in containers. And many times you can get it to overwinter. Sometimes if you cover it, that will help with extra cold winters. This last winter was quite warm, so all my kale overwintered, and then you can have leaves that you're harvesting early in the springtime before you've really planted anything that year. So that's a nice benefit. With kale and all the other brassicas, all the other crops in that family, so your broccoli and kale, or broccoli and cauliflower, collards, they all have a number of insect pests, a number of species of caterpillars that also like to feed on them. And if you don't manage them, they can easily, especially if they find your small plants, they can take those leaves and turn those leaves into, they can just skeletonize those leaves. So all that's left are the center ribs of those leaves. So you want to keep an eye out for those. Turn over the leaf. You often will find insects feeding on the underside of the leaf versus on the surface of the leaf. And there's a good product that is based on Bacillus thuringiensis. So it's a bacteria, a naturally occurring bacteria that produces a toxin. So this compound is toxic to caterpillars specifically. So it's a very targeted insecticide, and it's used very widely in agriculture. It's very effective, and again, it's very targeted. So seeing the pest and identifying it, and applying a product that is specific for that pest, and really reducing non-target issues. And it is just specific for caterpillars. So it does not harm other insects, including pollinators like honeybees. So Dipel and Thuricide are a couple of the different name brands, and you can find it's very widely available at big box stores, at garden centers, as well as online. So just make sure you read and follow the label as far as dilution and application instructions, but it's a pretty simple product to apply. Radishes, these are very quick growing. So if you want something that's quick and will grow, and you like radish, I know some folks don't like the spiciness, but these are quick growers, and you can use them to fill that empty space before you plant your warm season crop potentially. If you forget about them and they go to seed, they start flowering and are about to go to seed, like you see there on the right, they do produce these edible seed pods. And this is from my garden a couple years ago when I planted something and then got busy and harvested some, but didn't have a chance to make use of the rest. Well, those seed pods are also edible, and if you get them before they turn really tough and woody, then they're almost like a pea. So you can eat that entire pod, and you could toss it in stir fries and things like that. It has the spiciness of a radish, with more of a sweet hint to it. So it's got some of the spice, not all of that, and it has a nice crunch to it. So you can when it gets warmer, they have a tendency to go to flower. So if you've got them in your garden later in the season, like in end of May, early June, and we get some warm weather that comes through, then that will oftentimes encourage them to set out flowers like that. So keep an eye out for those edible seed pods. Carrots are another one, and these you can direct seed. You can also get seed tape, so it does the work for you. The seeds are embedded in what basically looks kind of like a thin layer of paper, or like a single ply of toilet paper almost. And that makes it easier, since the seeds are very small, makes it easier to evenly distribute the seeds. And seed tape is pretty commonly available as a way that carrots are sold. It doesn't have a whole lot of insect pests, and you want to make sure to thin those. If you're seeding by hand, to thin those to the appropriate spacing when they get tall enough, so your carrots won't crowd each other out. There's a lot of different colors of carrots out there, and if you flip through a seed catalog, I'm sure you've seen, you got yellows and whites and reds, or deep orange, as well as purples. And you can use the top. It's like parsley, so you can add it to soups or however you like to enjoy parsley. There is one interesting insect that you might see on your carrots or on your parsley. And so this is actually parsley. That family is host to the black swallowtail caterpillar. And this is one that was growing in a container a couple years ago. And I'll just play the little video there. They have some defenses. So if you touch or disturb the black swallowtail caterpillar, they will try and kind of lash out at you. They put out these horn-like protrusions as a scare tactic, basically to protect themselves against predators. And those protrusions, those protrusions also are very stinky, right? So almost instantly, when it put out those horns, you could smell this foul smell, again intended to scare off predators. So if you see those, they are eating the leaves, so you can choose to leave them or to flick them off if you want. But they are kind of cool, and so it's just thought I'd throw that out there as a little insect fact for your veggie gardening season. Beans, these are a great warm season crop. You can seed them May through July. I would just direct seed them and not spend time trying to transplant them because they are very quick growing. And there's a number of varieties, both bush and pole varieties. And yeah, you can kind of stagger your planting dates. Maybe plant a patch and then a week or two later, plant a second patch for a continuous harvest. There is one insect pest that can be an especially problematic one, and that is the Mexican bean beetle. And you can see in the upper photo both the adult as well as the immature stage and the eggs. So they look similar to lady beetles, but they feed on the leaves of plants. And when there's a lot of them, you can see in the lower photo, they can do a lot of damage and really take out and reduce the yield on your bean crop there. So if your plant leaves just look terrible, if the leaves are skeletonized like that, then it's a good chance if you take a closer look, you'll find some Mexican bean beetles. In that case, one thing that you can think of is just harvest all of the remaining beans that are on there, kind of regardless of size, and then get, especially if that crop is towards the end of its productive life, you can just cut down all the plants, stick them in a like a black plastic trash bag, and just leave it out in the sun for a couple of weeks, and that will kill off the Mexican bean beetles in there, and then you can take that in and compost that afterwards. But you've killed off that whole generation of Mexican bean beetles, and then you can plant a second crop. So you've reduced the total population of Mexican bean beetles, and hopefully that'll give you enough time to plant another crop. Summer squash and zucchini, again, these are large seeded ones that you can plant just directly in the ground without worrying about transplanting. There's different types. If you want a more compact plant, then look for a bush variety. There's also a lot of vining varieties, so you can make use of some of that vertical space. And of course, I think they're really nice in the kitchen because they can take on a lot of different flavors, and you can use them in a lot of different foods. If you grow any kind of squash or zucchini, you will definitely see these guys, squash bug. So they have similar coloration to the stink bug or brown marmorated stink bug that you might be familiar with. They go from their adult stage, that brownish color. The females lay eggs that are kind of brown bronze color, and when those hatch out as nymphs, they are light colored, kind of white to grayish, and they get larger and darker in color as they get closer to their adult stage, and then they continue the life cycle. They can be really difficult to control. If you see those on your leaves, you can just squish those eggs right on the leaf. Just squish them with your thumb, and so that can help to slow their spread. But of course, there's other eggs that are hiding that you probably won't find. So they can be difficult to control. Squash vine borer is another really common insect, and that's causing the damage that's on the lower picture there. So if you look around the base of the squash plant, zucchini or whatever, then you see that kind of brown, almost sticky, sometimes like powdery material that's not green and doesn't look like the plant. That is probably basically the feces of this guy. So the female lays its eggs, and the young, the larva, bore through the center of the vine, and so they do damage to that vine. And once it breaks, just due to loss of strength because it's got an insect boring through it, then plants can suddenly die. So that might be one of the reasons that one of the participants asked a question about why their zucchini suddenly die, and that is certainly a cause of death of zucchini plants if it goes from looking pretty healthy one day to all of a sudden wilted and collapsed the next day. There's a couple different fungal diseases, downy mildew and powdery mildew. So I encourage you to look for varieties that have some amount of resistance to these. There isn't great resistance out there in all the different crops, but again, if you're on a website of a seed catalog, or buying plants, look for resistance, because that will mean you be able to harvest that crop longer. As well as speaking to the squash vine borer, the species of squash that butternut belongs to, like Cucurbita moschata, because of its dense vine, it is tolerant or more resistant to squash vine borer. It's a thinner, denser stem, and so it's harder for those borers to make a go of it in those vines. So you can check out those for some resistance to squash vine borer. Sometimes it's kind of a battle. You choose your battles. If you get one that's resistant to one disease, then it might not be resistant to another. Cucumber is another great crop for any garden, including small spaces. It's a warm season crop, and you can direct seed it. There's a lot of different varieties, pickling varieties, slicing varieties. And again, for small spaces, if you can use that vertical space, there's a lot of varieties that climb pretty well. And this is just one example you can see there where it's clipped and I've got strings running vertically. And so we've got a lot of plants in a small area. Cucumbers, they have some insect pests as well. They have some of the same as zucchini and summer squash. Squash bugs, you'll find them on cucumbers as well. Cucumber beetles, both the spotted cucumber and striped cucumber beetles, are common insect pests on cucumbers. And unfortunately, they also transmit a bacterial disease. So their feeding damage is somewhat minimal, but more concerning is the bacteria that they can transmit that causes bacterial wilt disease. That can also it can cause pretty quick wilting of cucumber plants. They can be difficult to manage. There are insecticides that you can use on them. Unfortunately, most of the insecticide options in the vegetable garden are not as specific as some of the insecticides like BT for controlling caterpillars. So most of the insecticides for controlling your beetles, such as cucumber beetles and some of your bugs like squash bugs, are more broad spectrum, and they would also they can also affect pollinators. So that's why it makes it a bit more challenging to manage some of the beetles and bugs than it is our caterpillar pests. But some of the synthetic pyrethroids, so like the active ingredient in 7, the 7 brand name that you would find in the garden centers, that is it's effective against cucumber beetles, but it is broad spectrum. So, and yeah, just a quick comment that the cucumber varieties do matter. And going back to, well, actually, I think this one. So there are some varieties, and if you look in a good seed catalog or seed company website, so there are cucumber varieties that are parthenocarpic, so they can produce fruit without that flower being pollinated. And so then you would have a more productive plant. And so some of those plants then only grow female flowers. So that can have a big impact on the productivity of the plant. Some of the ones that are really that have good disease resistance would be the Bristol and Corinto, and these are some of the newer hybrids that you're probably not going to find at in most retail selections at a store, but you can certainly order online. And Tasty Jade is one that has okay disease resistance, and that's a Japanese slicing variety. If you've never had any of the Japanese varieties, they can be really sweet and just a really nice crunch. So some really nice eating qualities. Looking at some of those varieties again that you might not be able to find at the big box store seed selection. Tomatoes, and I think this is actually our last crop here before we wrap up. Tomatoes are ones that you want to transplant, so either grow your own or this time of year you probably be thinking about purchasing those transplants just because we are later in April. It's the most popular garden crop, and for good reason. There really is nothing like that homegrown tomato, like the John Denver song goes. There's indeterminate and determinate, so know which one is best for your site. So determinate tomato plants are shorter, whereas indeterminate will continue to grow and they can get quite tall. So for small spaces, especially containers, you want to think about some of the determinate varieties, and there are shorter, compact varieties, especially in the last couple of years. A number of companies have done a lot of good breeding work on developing like patio varieties that are better performing in small containers. There's a lot of different colors out there, of course, so you can choose your favorite size, shape, and color. Speaking to the weather, sometimes in the early season, again, if you have your tomatoes out in May, you're more likely to see this if we get cooler temperatures. And that's a condition called cat facing, and you can see the deformations, and this is on the underside of the fruit, so the side that's away from the stem. This is caused by poor pollination that is brought on by low temperatures. So if we have nights where it gets down into the 50s and your tomatoes are in the garden and they are blooming, then it can cause the flowers to be pollinated, but to have these issues with poor pollination. So it makes the fruit look weird, and but it's still edible. These ones are picked green, so certainly if you're growing them if you're a farmer and you're growing them, they're not sellable because no one would want to buy kind of a disfigured tomato, but you can still eat them. Again, just kind of cut off that other part and eat the red ripe part. Yeah, and a question, yeah, with tomatoes, you would want to not seed them directly in the ground, but to plant them out as transplants. So yeah, if you had tomato plants, say you've got tomato plants out in the garden right now, and they came with flowers on them, and we've got and they're blooming when we're in the 50s, then there's a good chance that those flowers that are on there through those cold temperatures would have some of these cat facing issues. So it's a good idea to just remove those flowers now. Blossom end rot is a really common disorder. It's not a disease. It's caused by a deficiency in the tissue of the fruit, a calcium deficiency in the tissue, and it's related to uneven water uptake. So calcium is dissolved in the water, and so it's brought into the plant and into the tomato fruit as the plant pulls up water through the roots into the tomato fruit. So anything that kind of interrupts that normal flow of water through the plant and into the fruit will can cause this this deficiency or this disorder. So it could be drought or excess moisture in the soil, and it can also be influenced by other plant stresses. So if you see that on some of your fruit, it just means that it went through either a drought period or it got too much water for a time. You can still eat those, just cut off the brown tissue, and the rest of the tomato is perfectly fine to eat. So keep an eye out for that. Tomato insect pests, there's the tobacco hornworm, and that's a really, it's a big one. So if you can find them, they're pretty well camouflaged, but sometimes you can spot them. And these guys, especially as the caterpillars get bigger, they can really chew a lot. So they can mow down, you know, that entire leaf blade. So they can take some pretty big chunks out of your leaves and also sometimes the fruit. So if you find them, you can, you know, pick them off and toss them away. When they get to this size, then something like BT would not be effective on them, because that's effective really on the earlier stages of caterpillars. All right. And a question about how often you should water your tomatoes. Excuse me, that really depends on the soil. So if you're growing in containers, then you have to water them frequently. So every day or every other day when the plants are really big and they're using up a lot of water. If it's in the ground and we're not getting rainfall, then you probably have to water them about once a week, depending on how much you put on. And stink bugs are another insect pest. They will feed on the fruit, so they have sucking mouth parts, and they'll cause this kind of damage that you can see on there's two pictures of tomatoes. So it causes kind of that opaque white splotchy damage. And again, it's not making the fruit inedible, so you can still eat it. It just that tissue that's lighter in color is kind of more spongy and doesn't have the same texture. Basically, they're sucking some of the sweet, delicious tomato juices out of your tomato. Oh, a question about as far as the best time of day to water the vegetable garden. You know, so moisture on leaves can help to facilitate some of these common tomato diseases and other fungal diseases. So if you can time your watering so your leaves can dry off before nighttime, that's ideal. And so that's I guess the quick answer. But you know, when it's raining out there, you can't control how much water they're getting or when they're getting. And back to stink bugs. Yeah, again, like our cucumber beetles, these are difficult to control with some of our softer insecticides, because things like BT are not effective on these. But there are some other products. So some of your pyrethroids are effective on these. But again, those are broad spectrum insecticides, unfortunately. So we don't have any other insecticide tools for the home garden to control stink bugs. And stink bugs are difficult to manage for farmers as well. Yeah, so just two common tomato diseases that you often see: early blight and septoria leaf spot. So with those, I encourage you on your tomato plants to prune off those lower leaves that are oftentimes not really doing a whole lot as far as contributing to the plant. And you can just pick off those lower leaves if they've got disease on them, and dispose of those to help reduce or slow the spread in the garden. But in the end, both of these diseases can be around, and you can still get a harvest. So especially if you have some disease on your lower leaves, oftentimes you'll still get a harvest from those plants, even without those lower leaves contributing a whole lot. All right. And then, okay, my last one, which is a herb, just because it goes so well in the veggie garden, is basil. And these are ones, again, they're very tiny seeded. So like our tomato, you want to plant these out as transplants. And there's a whole wide range of colors and flavors in the basil world. So if you haven't tried some of the different ones, like the purple basil, I encourage you to check some of those out. In addition to your standard Italian type basils. Um, so these are another thing that can really fit into the ornamental landscape because they're flowering, they're a pollinator magnet, and they're also edible. So kind of a win-win there. The one down in the corner there is Siam Queen. It's a Thai type basil with green leaves, and as you can see, the flower heads have that nice purple hue to them. Watch out for basil downy mildew, which is a pretty nasty disease of basil that when it's in your garden, it can take out all especially your Italian type basil plants. There's not really any controls that are effective against it. And there are, however, a couple resistant varieties that are out on the market. You can certainly buy them as seed. I don't know if any of those varieties will be out on the market like at most garden centers. But Obsession, Devotion, and Prospera are three of the resistant varieties. And some of the Thai type basil plants are less bothered by this disease, whereas Italian type basils are most susceptible to this. So you can consider, if you can't find some of those resistant varieties, consider growing some Thai type basil. And if you see this on your plants, it's safe to eat. So it's bad for basil, but it's okay for humans. So if you see that starting on the underside of the leaves, then it might be time to just harvest the whole plant and make a batch of pesto. And as far as, yeah, you can start transplants of basil now if you want, but give it kind of 6 to 8 weeks to plant those out in the garden. But if you've got them, you start them now and put them in the garden in June, then you still have a number of good months of basil. All right. And then just a couple quick maintenance tips. As you're out in your garden, to water deeply and less frequently. Not really something that you would do in containers because there's only so deep that you can go. But especially if you're growing in ground, to water deeply, not just spray the plants, but make sure you water thoroughly, and so it soaks down and doesn't just encourage really shallow rooted plants. Go out in the garden every day, and then you can keep an eye and pull some of the weeds, um, and keep an eye out for some of those insects and diseases. Uh, Encourage you to make use of vertical space through staking or trellising things like tomatoes, any of your vining crops, cucumbers, and so forth. Get them up off the ground. It makes them easier to harvest, and it makes it easier to get around the garden and makes better use of your square footage. And fertilize, again, you can fertilize based off of the soil test results if you send a sample off. If not, there are some good guides on fertilizing on the HGIC website. And just to kind of wrap up, recapping some of the high points, start small, especially if you're new to veggie gardening. And feed the soil, again, based on those soil test results. And think about gardening, veggie gardening, as not just, hey, I'm planting stuff in the spring, but think about planting stuff in the summer and later on in the early fall. Which is good because even if you plant stuff in the spring and groundhogs destroy it, then there is still hope because you can still plant stuff later on in the season to make use of that cool season in the fall. Yeah, get out there as much as possible to keep an eye on your garden, check for weeds and insects and disease issues, and I just encourage you to grow something new that you like the flavor of it, or like something because of its its unique color or shape. Just get creative and to share your harvest with your friends and neighbors. At least during a normal season. I think gardening is a great way to get to know your neighbors and share some of your harvest. All right, and just a couple resources. The Home and Garden Information Center is the online source for all things garden related for Maryland gardeners, and they sort it out by topic. So there's a lot of good information on vegetables, and there's a section on insect pests of vegetables, and a whole range of information there, as well as the YouTube channel, and they have a pretty active blog as well. So if you go to that, if you just Google Maryland HGIC, you can pull up the website and get linked into all the different resources there. And the Master Gardener program, again, that's a group of trained volunteers that provide education throughout the community. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with me, and we have a program in all across the state. So it's a great group of volunteers. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have in the chat here. And I apologize if I didn't get your question earlier in the talk. Feel free to throw it in there again. So let's see. I can. Someone has a question: if any of the vegetables grow out in the wild, and so most of the vegetable crops have been, originally were from the wild, but have been developed and selected over many years for their fruit size, for particular qualities. So none of the ones that I listed would become established, I guess, in the wild. I don't know if that's exactly what you were asking in that question, but yeah, feel free to ask again if that didn't cover it. What purpose do the hoops serve in the containers? Okay, so back earlier I had a photo of those hoops in the containers. I think I had those hoops up. So those hoops can be used to support that white non-woven fabric-like material, floating row cover that's used to keep insects off veggies. And so I think in that case, the hoops were just, they weren't serving any purpose at that time, but you can use those hoops or PVC or other kinds of hoops as supports for putting on that a white row cover to keep insects off. All right. Someone question about seedlings. Are cardboard egg cartons too shallow to use to seed veggies? Egg cartons, you can use them for starting some stuff. And let's see, the cardboard ones. You can also, if you have plastic ones, you could use those as well. It depends. So if you're trying to get a tall, tomato transplant that's, that you transplant when it's, 8 or 10 inches, then that might not be enough rooting depth for those transplants. Um, but for smaller things, you should be able to grow them in something that depth. Um, all right, yeah, someone commented asparagus. Yeah, there's a lot of other great crops out here. This is just a selection of them. Um, but asparagus is a great perennial crop. And yeah, if anyone has asparagus, feel free to send that my way. I love fresh asparagus. Um, for a brand new raised bed garden, still in the building stage, 9 feet by 6 feet, what soil or compost do you recommend? Percentages for how much soil, compost, or wood matter? Um, let's see. Okay, so for raised bed, um, if you have a source already, it depends, I guess. Um, if you have if you have a larger property and you have a source, if you have a pile of soil somewhere, or you can move it from somewhere else on your property, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to go out and purchase soil, but you can, um, if you have some just native soil in the area, you can use that to fill, and you can blend that with a little bit of compost, something like a leaf grow or other high quality compost. Um, with some of the mixes, like if you're getting, let's see, I'm not sure exactly how tall your beds are. If it's 9 by 6 and it's really deep, that can be a lot of material. So I'm not sure if it's something that you would be filling with bagged product or not. If you're buying bagged products, you can look for ones that are certified. There's a couple different industry certifications. The Mulch and Soil Council, that is one, that um, means that that they submit samples to regular testing. Um, Sometimes with the bulk stuff, it can be a lot less expensive. I would take a look at it before you get delivery of it. If you look at a scoop of it and it looks like it's basically topsoil with some wood chip mulch blended in, then it's probably not very high quality, and you might want to think about another source. Certainly, buying bulk, if you need that much, is less expensive per unit than buying in those like 1 square foot, 1 cubic foot bags from the store. So that can add up if you're buying bagged products. Um, and sometimes, yeah, depending on the source, you can get mixed, compost, topsoil, that's delivered. Again, it depends on how much you need. If which one is the makes the most sense financially. Um, let's see. What seed catalogs do you recommend, and how do you get them? So I can't recommend one seed company over another, but you can check out different seed company websites, and they will often you can click to request a catalog. Some of the ones that have more information, you can use them as resources too, and not necessarily again, you can take it to, say you've got, you want to plant something now, and again with these disruptions and with COVID-19, you might wind up buying them locally, but you can check out places like yeah, a number of different websites, and they'll send you a printed copy of their catalog. I don't know what the turnaround time on a printed catalog would be this time of year, though. Just it's already their busy season. All right, then a question about potting soil. Does it contain compost? Um, I hope I'm getting the rest. Was that all the question? So potting soil, So if it contains the word soil, then typically it has a mineral, so sand, silt, or clay in it. And if it's sold as potting mix, then it's typically just organic matter, so a blend of peat moss, compost. It depends. So if you look on the back, it should have some type of an ingredients list, and that will say, not necessarily the exact percentage of each product that it contains. Most potting soils or most potting mixes contain some amount of peat moss. Some contain a certain amount of compost, and most of them contain, especially the less expensive ones, or the potting soils typically will contain some type of finely shredded wood product. What organic fertilizers do you recommend that I add to my soil for leafy vegetables like kale and spinach, tomatoes and potatoes? Should I focus on the numbers? I'll be using grow bags. Um, so let's see, for organic fertilizers, um, yeah, organic fertilizers typically contain a number of their so if they're organic fertilizers, typically coming from animal sources, so they could be bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, as well as from like poultry litter and things like that. Um, and again, there's not one specific brand I would recommend. Um, if you are growing in ground and you have your soil test results, try to find a fertilizer that matches up with the proportions on that soil test report. So if it says that you need to add, X number of pounds of nitrogen, X number of pounds of phosphorus and potassium, just try and get the same ratios or similar ratios as your soil tests report calls for. So, and feel free to email me if you have follow-up questions, and some of the fertilizer stuff can get kind of complicated. Um, let's see. Okay. Let's see. I've had tomato plants that grow leaves and stalks but never produce fruit or very little fruit. Good sunny location. Plants look healthy. All other plants in the bed did well. Cucumber, broccoli, and squash, etc. Am I missing some sort of nutrient? Um, that's a good question, and something I should have mentioned. The one thing about tomatoes is that if they are, and I guess I should ask the question, if you are fertilizing them, or how much fertilizer you're giving them. But one thing with tomatoes is that if they are in full sun and the plants look really healthy and green and lush, but they really don't produce a whole lot of fruit, that oftentimes is a sign that the plants are getting too much fertilizer. So you can kind of think of it as the tomato plants being too content, and so they have all the nutrients they need. And if they're over fertilized, they won't go from that kind of vegetative stage, focusing on growing nice lush green foliage, into the fruiting stage where they're producing lots of flowers and in turn tomato fruit. So that's often a really big healthy tomato plants that aren't productive is often an indication that they're getting too much, especially nitrogen. What do you think about coffee grounds in the soil? So yeah, coffee grounds you can add to it's great um, you can add it to compost piles and things like that. And if you are growing in containers or something like that, you could blend it in a bit with the potting mix. Um, it doesn't, as far as nutrient availability, the coffee grounds will have to break down and decompose somewhat before those nutrients are available to the plant. So I wouldn't take a whole bunch of coffee grounds and mix a lot of that into the soil. But it will, over time, if you put some on the soil surface, or you blend it, you put it in a small percentage in a potting mix that shouldn't cause any problems. But it's going to have to break down and decompose before it's making those nutrients available to the tomato plant or to your vegetable plants. And then a question about eggshells. I'm not exactly sure what the question is. So if you could clarify that. Another question is, do I need to buy fertilizer if I buy a potting soil mix? That's a good question. And so it depends. So some potting mixes will say that it contains a slow release nutrient source. So there's these tiny little round things, and they're basically nutrient pellets that are designed to slowly release throughout the season. And so if you have one of those, if it says that it contains a slow release nutrient blend, then especially if you're growing like fruit or leafy crops, then you may not have to fertilize. If you have a really productive tomato plant, for example, then it probably, as it's gotten partway through producing tomatoes, then it's probably starting to use up the nutrients that came in the bag. So you might want to add just kind of a general purpose fertilizer, like the kind that you can just mix up in a can and add every couple of weeks or once a month. Oh, okay, and clarification, yeah, the hoops on the tomato plants in the container garden photos were supporting the tomato plants. So it's kind of a makeshift way to keep them upright. And then, okay, my mom used to put eggshells around her plants. Not sure if it was to help grow or to discourage insects. And so yeah, eggshells, you can certainly put them in the compost pile, and eventually when they make it to the garden, it's a source of calcium carbonate, and so over time they would break down. I don't know if that's why she added them as a way to provide calcium to the soil and in turn the plants. Since they're it's big pieces, putting eggshells in the garden, again, it would take a while because those nutrients aren't available to the plants. I'm not really sure if it would have any effect on deterring insects from feeding on the plants. I'm not aware of a real effective way to control insects with eggshells. So I think, all right, I think that's all I see for questions. Okay, and someone said, yeah, that their grandmother used it to try and prevent blossom end rot, and that's because eggshells contain calcium carbonate. But yeah, usually that's a question, that it's not necessarily readily available to the plants that growing season. So I think a more effective way would be to ensure that your calcium levels are sufficient in the soil, but B, most importantly, is to ensure adequate soil moisture, so not drought conditions and not super saturated standing water. So that would be the most effective way to, even watering would be the best way to reduce blossom end rot. Another question, I have a very compacted soil and it's difficult to grow root veggies. Do you have any suggestions? Yeah, with compacted soil or really heavy, fine textured soils like clay soils, it can be more difficult to grow, nice straight carrot like maybe a friend has really sandy soil and they can grow really nice straight carrots or other root crops. So anything you can do to try and alleviate some of that compaction, slowly adding and incorporating organic matter into your garden over the years, like by adding compost, is one way to reduce compaction. Um, and you could also think about, putting a raised bed on, um, in part of your garden, and growing those root crops like your, carrots and so forth in that raised bed, that you then fill with. You can use a native soil and amend it with a bit of compost, and just when you are scooping that soil up and filling up the raised bed, that's um, breaking up some of those compacted soil clods. And since with raised beds you're not walking, you're not driving on it, then you're not recompacting the soil. So that's a couple different ways you might think about alleviating some of those soil compaction issues. Is there a safe way to get rid of moles in a garden? Not those, but not using spikes, and something that. Okay, so I don't know. By spikes, do you mean the the traps, the kill traps, or some of the or a different product? Moles. So moles are pretty prolific tunnelers, and you'll see them in the yard or in the garden, and they'll push up that soil as they're burrowing and tunneling. They're excavating and getting that out of their tunnel as they continue to burrow. Um, So okay, so yeah, as far as ways to deal with them, you can there are traps you can set, like kill traps. Um, that is one way. Now it's something that you have to go out there and tend, and empty it. After it's caught a mole. Um, but yeah, other than traps, a lot of the other um, ways are not very effective or not very consistent. Unfortunately, they can be kind of difficult to deal with. Um, and I apologize. I mean, so moles. Yeah. So okay, yeah, never mind. Okay, you're talking about moles. Yep. So they're in the ground, they're burrowing around, and they're feeding on invertebrates under the soil. Um, and since there's no way to reduce their food source, right? Because any healthy soil will have different invertebrates living there. There's always going to be a food source around for them, and so other than the kill traps, there's not a real effective way, and that can be a lot of work to manage. All right. Any other questions out there? If not, thank you for tuning in. And if I didn't fully answer your questions, or if you have follow-up ones, yeah, feel free to shoot me an email. I will, let's see, my contact info is there. And feel free to check out next week. That'll be some of the same information, but focusing specifically on smaller spaces, on container gardens, and so forth. As far as, when you can start your fall garden, um, for broccoli. So you can think about starting those, if you're doing them indoors, you can start those transplants in July, and then transplant those out in August. So like mid August, you could think about transplanting those into the mid to late August. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.